Yeah.
Really?
All right, let's go ahead and get started for today. Happy Friday. And I hope that your second week has been going well and hopefully been a little bit more normal. So welcome back. Today is sort of our last day discussing the major idea of what it means to be a good and effective listener. So we'll be talking about some of the details and ideas related to that. After this week, we'll be transitioning into a discussion surrounding some of the ways that communication happens through media. So I've given you snippets of a textbook for reading, but we'll start to transition into articles and kind of engaging with current events and other issues to understand listening as a process, right? So we'll start to use the skills we've talked about in these first couple of weeks and apply them to a lot of different areas. As a reminder, I shared this through Canvas announcement, but again, I know that there are some cases where people have COVID exposure or risk of exposure. If that happens, remember that you want to run through student affairs, who can give you the official information and paperwork that'll help you to isolate. Remember that you're always welcome to join us through the Zoom meeting if you're not able to come face to face. And then if you can't do that, that I post the recordings right after class so that you can complete the makeup assignment and watch those. But you can always watch for review as well as we're going through some of these things in class. So I also want to remind you that the week 2 quiz is due by this Sunday. Now that we're back on the normal schedule, that just covers the second week's worth of readings. So make sure to complete that by this Sunday if you haven't done so already. So last class, we talked about some of the steps and requirements related to active listening, right? I asked you to sort of define and explain what it means to be a good and active listener. So some of the things that we talked about, including the activity that we did with active listening, was involving the use of good feedback, right? Using nonverbal communication or even verbal signals like saying, yeah, and so on to indicate that you're understanding and paying attention to the message. So we also apply that to conversations, right? How we can use active conversations and listening. And then we also talked about on Wednesday, the assignment that used our in-class activity as a starting point to think about ways that we can work on our listening skills. As a reminder, right, active listening is about the behaviors that we do, right, so that we try to create a good environment for listening, we try to pay attention, we try to bring our minds back if it wanders a little bit, and also cognitive practices, right, adjusting, using coaching to help us listen better. We are thinking about and applying listening in a way that is meaningful to us. So you might think about what you're getting from listening and what you gain from understanding and getting to know the person that you're talking to a little bit better. So thinking about the goals and what you're ultimately trying to achieve through listening. Maybe it's a class and you're trying to figure out information to prepare you for an exam or an assignment. Maybe it's a friend and you want to see how they're doing or check in. Thinking about goals for listening can really help us to become better listeners because it lets us refocus. We're just following along and somebody's droning on. We don't know why that message is important. It's a lot harder to be a good active listener. We also talked through the listening assessment activity. Again, this is using the in-class active listening where you all exchange some stories and applied some skills of active listening. That's due on the 26th. So that's about a little less than 2 weeks away. As a reminder, in order to access this assignment, you can do so through Canvas. So if you go in on the front page of Canvas for this course, then you can access the material that you need to complete this. So if you scroll down, week number 3, right, you'll notice that that activity is due. And then the prompt and rubric are available there. I recommend if you need help with writing, formatting, and other skills, you can reach out to the EOU Writing Center, which is a great resource that can look over drafts, You can also check out, again, the Purdue OWL, which is great for source citation. And you can get in touch with me with drafts, outlines, or meet with me like in an office meeting if you want to go over your assignment in a little bit more detail too. Just have that on your radar. It's not a long writing assignment, but it is a way to get you starting to think about and use some of these ideas in the class. Please also remember that you have a nice long weekend. Next Monday is Martin Luther King Day, so we are not going to be meeting in class next Monday. So our next class meeting is going to be the following Wednesday. So I think that's the 19th is our next class meeting. So just know that that's coming. Any questions regarding the listening assessment, the quiz, anything else related to the class at this point? Questions do come up at any point, just let me know. So for this class, I want to take some time to talk about, now that we've talked about active listening, some of the steps that are involved in both critical listening and active empathic listening. One idea that we've brought up in the class is the importance of context, right? It's not just the idea that we listen and we pay attention, but that the way that we're listening and taking in the message is going to look really different depending on the goals and the type of message that we're hearing. I'll also be asking you to do an activity later in the class where you're applying these two different styles of listening to make sense of a story. We'll also be talking about the importance of creating a good environment, right, or physical setting in which listening happens, and also the idea that good messages need to be listenable. For instance, it's the responsibility of the person who is sharing the message to make their message make sense, right? If somebody doesn't have their microphone on, that's on them. And so we can't expect somebody to listen if they're not delivering a message we can hear. So if you've ever done something like disassemble a computer, right? You're breaking down the computer into its different parts. Maybe you have things that correspond to the monitor, to the keyboard, to the data, and the way the data is stored, to the way that it receives power, such as the battery, right? If you're disassembling a computer or car, right, you're breaking it down essentially to understand how it works, right? You're assessing the different parts of it. Maybe you have a computer that isn't working the way that you want it to, and you disassemble it and you replace something like a graphics chip. That's an example of the way that we do critical listening, except instead of different parts of a computer, right, it's different parts of an idea or an argument or a speech or something that somebody is telling you about. So critical listening and critical thinking more generally, right, is about taking a step back and not taking a message that you receive as a given, right? It's not taken for granted. You start to really assess whether the message is effective or not, right? Some people consider critical listening to be the deepest form of listening because you're really having to sit there and make sense of the message in a way that is more than just appreciation, right? But is really taking apart its key ideas and arguments. For instance, again, chances are that if you are listening to something like a political speech or a debate among a candidate that you find yourself disagreeing with, there's a couple things that'll probably happen, right? There might be prejudiced listening, where you're using sort of mind guards and safety in order to prevent yourself from being persuaded or changed. But you also are probably doing some critical listening too, where you think, you know, their claims about this topic are incorrect. I don't agree with them in how they're talking about this issue. So critical listening is really trying to focus on picking things apart. For instance, one example of critical listening is whenever there's something such as major speech like the State of the Union address, a lot of media outlets will basically go through the text of the speech, highlight some of the sentences and the major claims that are made, and assess whether they're true or false, right? A lot of times in something like a debate, there's an assessment of false and misleading statements. That's an example of listening critically to try to understand and make sense of the message. So one example, right, of critical listening is suggesting what led you to think this. So why is somebody believing a message or sharing a message in a way that maybe doesn't align with what you think? For instance, you say, you know what, we should get a cat because cats are friendlier and more affectionate than dogs. You might say, wait, why do you think this? Because in my experience, dogs have been a lot more friendly, right? And your friend explains that they had a really friendly cat growing up. So critical listening helps us to track the source and figure out the information that somebody is using to make their major argument. Another key idea here, right, is assessing credibility. So credibility, right, or ethos is about the reputation, background, is somebody trustworthy? And critical thinking lets us figure out if that person is worth trusting. So where did you hear the message? Where did you hear the idea that you're sharing? So if you have a relative that's talking about COVID-19 and you're really confused about what they're saying about it, you disagree factually, you might say, where did you hear that message? How do you know something, right? What leads you to believe whether something is true or false? So epistemology, right, is the field that tries to develop how we know things. How do we get knowledge? How do we get information, right? So the process of getting, taking in information is an important part of being an effective communicator. We might also think about what isn't included in the message, what's missing. So for instance, if somebody is talking about getting a pet and they're talking about how affectionate and loyal and sweet that is to have a pet, they might not be talking about the cost, about the labor involved, and whether or not you have a place that you could even raise a pet in. So it's important to listen critically to think about what is and is not included within the message. Right? One thing I like to talk about a lot, if you take a class like argumentative writing over in English, you might be familiar with some of the critical thinking practices. One thing that I like to talk about is logical fallacies, right? Arguments going wrong, or situations in which advancing an argument just has some major flaws or gaps. One example, right, is if cats have 4 legs and I have 4 legs, therefore I'm a cat, right? That's faulty logical reasoning. This little basset hound is not a cat, right? So effective critical listening means identifying fallacies and problems like this one. So a syllogism, right, going back to Socrates and Aristotle, right, suggests a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is warping it and not doing a good use of syllogism. All cats have 4 legs, I have 4 legs, therefore I'm a cat. Because, right, just because somebody has 4 legs does not mean there's a cat. There's alternative explanations. So those things do not connect in the way that this argument is claiming that they are. Another super common example of a logical fallacy is an ad hominem. How many people have heard that term before? Ad hominem. Ad hominem is when you are attacking the person, right? And you're attacking the person's credibility rather than the actual argument that they have to say, right? So maybe you say, here are all the reasons why I think you should get a cat. And then somebody responds by saying, well, I think you're stupid, right? That's not really responding to the message, that's just responding to the person. We see this all the time in things like attack ads and so on, right? In social media and political communication. There's a lot of other logical fallacies we can talk about, right? One of them being that correlation is not causation, right? Just because 2 things are connected in space and time does not mean that one causes the other. For instance, there's a lot of really funny correlations, like in years where mayonnaise consumption is higher in the United States, more people die in skiing accidents. But it'd be weird to say if you eat mayonnaise, you're going to die while skiing, right? They're connected in time, but there's not actually a cause-effect relationship. So those are the things that you can start to flag and notice as you're listening critically to a message. Be careful, right, about either or options. So classic example, right, under the George W. Bush administration, that was, kind of became a common saying, right, was either you're with us or against us, right? The idea that there's these either or allies or enemies. Either we can only get pizza or get Thai food, right? Suggesting that there are other options. So be careful about when an either or message is being made. Also be careful about overgeneralizations, right? If somebody says, I'm always in a good mood, there's a good chance that that's false, right? So be careful when you hear somebody make always or never statements. Another major problem, right, an issue with how we listen is if we pay too much attention to the person and not to their message, then we're going to lose sight of a lot of the key ideas, right? In fact, when there are speakers, right, folks that are women and people of color, they disproportionately receive like audience feedback based on their physical appearance that, again, don't really correspond to the content of what they're trying to say. Evaluation takes time, right? Thinking about a message, understanding a message, and breaking it apart is not something that you can do right away. You've got to take the time to do that. And another idea, right, is to avoid mind reading, to avoid thinking that you know what the person you're listening to is trying to do or say. Because you really want to focus on the content rather than assuming what it is that the other person is doing in their goals. So those are some things to think about when it comes to critical listening and developing those critical listening skills. Again, we should do this if we're trying to make sense of or process messages that might have significant and important impacts on our lives. So the other major category of listening to think about is active empathic listening. I used an example the other day. How many folks have either read or watched To Kill a Mockingbird? Yes, so most of you, right? It's a classic piece of literature that we see in like middle and high school, right? And main character, or one of the main characters, right, Atticus Finch, is a lawyer who is defending, right, a Black man who's falsely being accused of assault. And his kind of famous saying about empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and walking around in them for a while, right? An active empathic approach is very much taking that style of listening to task. Active empathic listening is really about showing that you care and that you're invested in the other person and their message, right? So active empathic listening means that you are signaling to the other person that you're there for them. Maybe, for instance, if somebody says, hey, I need to talk to you about something that's happened in my family. I have a family member that's really sick, right? One way that you could respond is by taking your phone down and really like looking that person in the eye and showing you're paying attention in a way that you didn't before. It's also the idea that you believe in and you value the message on its own terms, right? You care enough about the other person, about what it is that they're saying, that you choose to still listen to them and you care. If they're dealing with a major challenge or family health issue, that's something that's getting your attention and wanting you to listen. So this is in many ways the opposite of critical listening, right? Because you're not trying to listen to analyze and judge the other person. If somebody is dealing with a major family tragedy, like they have a family member that's really sick and they start saying, oh my God, like I feel like, my cousin is going to die. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm in an awful place, right? Maybe realistically, you know that the cousin is not going to die. Maybe there's a little bit of overreaction going on, right? But that's not something that you center in your response. You don't say, no, they're not going to die. You're wrong, right? Because that's not very sensitive to that person's emotions and the challenges that they're dealing with. Instead, you might say, hey, I understand that you're feeling really worked up and that you're really having a hard time with this. What can I do to help? Additionally, one thing that we oftentimes do when it comes to active and empathic listening is that we mirror or change the way that we communicate, especially non-verbally, to meet the needs of the other person. One really good example of this is notice the way that your tone and volume changes if the conversation takes a turn, right? Maybe you're talking fairly quickly and you feel pretty open and your pitch goes down, your rate of delivery goes down as somebody is talking about a heavier or more challenging topic. So we oftentimes show similar nonverbal communication to the other person to show that we're on a similar wave, right? Generally speaking, being a good active and empathic listener means that you're in an okay place yourself, right? That you have good self-esteem and confidence yourself, such that you feel like you can be there for the other person. You come in with a lot of baggage or you're not in a good place, right? then oftentimes you find that it's really hard to connect or to pay attention. You get preoccupied. And active empathic listening, right, is really exhausting. It takes a lot of time and work. In fact, right, people that are professionally trained, like therapists and counselors in this style of listening, find that the work is really taxing and exhausting, right? There's a lot of burnout that comes from, as a career, being focused on an active listening because you exert so much mental and emotional energy to pay attention to the other person. So those are some things to know about this style of listening, right? That it's really focused on understanding and showing support rather than judging the other person. So I want to talk about a couple other things before we do kind of a prompt that engages with some of these ideas. One of them being the idea of a listening environment, right? So we can think about environment as the layer of communication. And to be a good and attentive and thoughtful listener, it means we need to create an environment or physical setting in which that listening is facilitated. A really good example of this is listening when it comes to a lot of professional organizations and companies. For instance, companies such as Apple and Valve, the video game company, are really known for creating kind of unique styles of organizational structure that do facilitate forms of listening and communication. If you find yourself in a place like through your work where you're rarely, if ever, communicating to your coworkers, and the communication you do have is really short or really task focused, right? That generally is not a great listening environment. Or if you grew up in a household, right, where your family members told you that children are to be seen, not heard, and that it didn't really encourage you expressing your own ideas, that could be an example of a negative listening environment that hurts your own communication. So the physical setting and context plays a really big role here in how to listen and engage in good communication. So there's a lot of different ways, right, that we can create a good listening environment. So I'm going to show a short video that I think helps to crystallize some of these ideas. One of them is that if you have a lot of distractions, right, maybe you have like really large windows or you have a lot of music playing, getting rid of those barriers, right, gets rid of the physical noise. It can be a really big distraction in every stage of the process. Creating shared language, right? That might be the use of things like inside jokes or jargon or phrases that members of a group develop over time. For instance, maybe a place of work has a holiday party and they do a white elephant exchange every year. Maybe that annual activity is an event that creates shared listening and communication among people in the group. Creating spaces that are specifically designed for listening, things like a lounge or common space, can be a really great way that organizations create good listening. Creating those opportunities, right? For instance, sometimes if people in an organization or group are considering an idea or proposal, they might create a public comment period or an opportunity for people to share their input and for those to listen to the ideas. Training and leadership play a really big role too, right? If you find yourself in like a team captain or supervisor or managerial type role, being a person that shows you're available to listen creates a model for everybody else and shows that you care enough about listening that other people should too. So I want to share an example from the late Steve Jobs, who was the former CEO of Apple, right, who talks a little bit about the organizational structure and culture at Apple. And I wanted to share this example because I think it offers really good insight into how organizations can design themselves to facilitate good communication. So as you're watching, pay attention to the way he talks about organization and the ways that members within a company like Apple choose to communicate.
One of the keys to Apple is Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And so, you know how many committees we have at Apple?
No.
0. We have no committees.
No committee.
We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software. One person's in charge of Mac hardware. One person's in charge of iPhone hardware engineering. Another person's in charge of worldwide marketing. Another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet. And we all meet for 3 hours once a week, and we talk about everything we're doing, the whole business. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts. And that's what we do really well. And we're great at figuring out how to divide things up in these great teams that we have and all work on the same thing, touch bases frequently, and bring it all together into a product.
So I like that example, right? Because it really talks through some of the ways that an organization like Apple can create a positive listening environment. And again, you might think about your own professional organizations or groups that you're a part of, maybe through work, school clubs, and so on, and start to think about ways to facilitate more positive listening environment there too. The idea that even if there are people in positions of leadership like CEOs, that they have a designated time to sit down and to talk about the issues, that there is that specific space to address the goals and purpose of the group, and so on, are some of the ways that a good listening environment can be facilitated. So we talked about this. I know there's a couple from my other class who we already talked to about this, but you might be familiar with cultures, right? And the ways that cultures relate to listening. One major idea of cultures is differences in context, right? So context is the idea that there is background information about an issue. If you're talking to a friend and that friend is really anxious because they have an interview coming up for a job, that's context that shapes your conversation, right? You're not going to talk to them about a bunch of overwhelming information if they're prepping for an interview and feel really anxious, right? You adapt your communication, including your listening, to the situation that you find yourself in. So context, right, is the idea that in cultures like the United States or Australia, right, generally speaking, we say what we mean, and that there's less elements of nonverbal communication, subtlety, and norms that impact communication. For instance, if you do not want to buy something that somebody's selling you, you say, no, I don't want that. No, thank you, right? So it's a lot more normal to be direct in your communication. And what that means for you as a listener, right, is that you generally pay attention to the verbal communication and you take the messages at face value. In higher context cultures, such as Japan and China, right, these are cultures that tend to be more collectivist. That is, they tend to focus more on the interests and harmony of the group. Oftentimes, this is because collectivist cultures have much higher populations as a whole. But in these types of cultures, there's a greater emphasis on listening and also on high context, where there's more subtleties and subtext that impacts communication as a whole. For instance, right, in a high context culture, you might find that you are doing things such as saying maybe, or I don't know, or being more hesitant instead of saying no if somebody's trying to sell you something, because you don't want to hurt that person's feelings. That might be a norm that culture develops that's less direct and doesn't align quite as much with saying what you mean. There are some differences in regards to gender, right? Gender is not something that means that you're hardwired to have differences in how you communicate and listen, but there are some differences in how we're socialized or told to listen, right? Oftentimes men find themselves in more like action or task-oriented listening styles, and women are oftentimes stereotyped more in people-oriented listening styles. But there's a lot of variation and difference there, right? And there's been a lot of work to combat and try to break down some of the stereotypes about gender and listening. So the last idea, before I want to have you all work on this activity, is to think about what makes messages listenable, right? The idea that we create messages that are designed for other people to understand and to hear clearly. And again, to use an example, if you're chatting on Zoom, like maybe one of your professors is done and they are muted, right? It's on them to unmute themselves and make that message happen. There have been horror stories of like professors who for entire classes have been muted, and then like students haven't checked or they haven't checked the chat or even know how to use the chat. And then by the end, they're like, oh, I was muted the whole time. So to make a message listenable, right? To make a message that you can help somebody understand and hear, there's a few different ways to do this. And this matters, right? Because at least in one point in our lives, every one of us has felt like we're not listened to. We're not being heard, or the ideas that we bring to the table aren't being understood in the way that we wish that they were, right? So creating a listenable message for us means creating communication that helps us be understood and to be heard. There's a couple ways to do this, right? Short and active sentences. Run-on sentences just go forever and ever are not going to do very well in helping the other person understand, especially if they're taking in a lot of information. Using I and me language, personal pronouns, is a really good way to make your message understood. I think we should do X, right? My opinion is Y. Helps you to establish agency to your sentence. Using lists and organizations, right? Again, I'm a big fan of using roadmaps and signposting. There are 3 reasons why I think you should do this, right? And then using examples, right? Incorporating active examples and applications that help to show and make the information clear to other people. For instance, a listenable message is like a microphone, making sure that you're hearing and understanding properly. You can also integrate feedback, right? When you're hearing a message and responding to that message, right? You might focus on ways that a speaker could improve or better align what they're having to say with how they say it. So again, as a speaker, we also have responsibility to create messages that people can understand and follow clearly. So here's what I'd like us to do. I have a short story here, and I'm going to ask you to find a partner, potentially a group of 3. I'm going to have the Zoom folks together as a group of 3, so I'll create a breakout room for you in just a minute. So I have the story here from Harold. And Harold says, I've been having such a rough time lately. My boss just fired me from my job, and now I don't know what to do. Yes, I was late a few times, but I explained why to my boss. My alarm clock hasn't been working properly, and I haven't been able to fix it. Now I'm not sure if I have the time to search for new jobs. My mom's coming over to visit, so I'll be really busy. It doesn't feel like I have much control over my life. So using this story in your partnership and group of 3, you can write or type this for attendance. I want you to explain how you would understand the story using active and passive listening in the way that we've talked about it in the class. Then secondarily, I want you to explain how you use critical listening for this story and how it would be different than active and passive listening. And then lastly, I want you to think about whether or not you feel like this is a listenable message. Why or why not? So again, I'll give you the chance to work in a partnership or group of 3 to talk through this story and to write or type how you feel like you would employ these different strategies to make sense of the message. I will also get the breakout room going for those of you on Zoom. So go ahead and find somebody or group of 3 sitting near you and get started in working through this story. Yeah.
Being able to like emphasize and talk about it.
I think I would just like, oh, involves self-esteem. You didn't need that job. Yeah. You deserve better. Sure.
Just listenable.
Yeah, it's real.
Maybe offer help.
Yeah.
So it's so critical listening.
Critical and
Yeah, he uses the
I think just
Trying
like
to
right.
calm it down.
So after.
Definitely a
You can say like maybe.
And then just like understand.
Uses examples. Yeah. How would you use critical listening?
That's kind of a weird one. How would you do that?
I would question.
I think I would question it too. Because I'd be like, why don't you just?
Like, I'm trying to fix it, why don't you get a little more?
But I'd be nice about it. I'm like, how about I give you like $5 to go buy? Oh, wow.
He's gonna need it.
And actually giving them evidence that you're listening.
But you're also like.
Be cautious of either or options. Evaluate.
Yeah, that's one like that.
I would just first be lazy.
I was wondering what he's hiding. If I was like that, you made it, I'm just gonna keep that.
I thought.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Everyone has
Yeah.
something to fight.
You might be sad or something.
He says I
Might be
feel like I
depressed and
don't have
stressing.
much control of my life. That's what the story is.
Yeah.
I-
So like, is your job stressing you out?
One, let me know how left, the other one.
I got it as like
Yeah.
I like bigger shit, you know, but it's like bad.
Definitely in a spot.
How is it different?
Yeah.
I guess it'd be more.
I think it's more like, it kind of feels more judgment. Like,
More content for you, right?
yeah.
And personal.
Critical thinking is more
W-I-L-L-Y.
action motivated and an active topic listener.
I can't skip.
Thanks.
C-A-N.
Poor dude. It doesn't feel like I have much. Well, that's sad.
So give you about 5 more minutes or so, you might start to transition toward a listenable message. Yeah, what's up, William? You can just do like a couple sentences, you know, just enough that helps you to share. Yes, everybody can have.
Okay, so the first one.
I think that's why. Oh, geez.
That's something, yeah. So. It's not gonna be late. I don't know.
I'm definitely. But being super tired. I can fall for corrections.
Right.
I was like, dead.
I was actually seeing this. I probably not that.
Okay, that's good. When I was. There was like one thing that was icy. That was so annoying. Yeah.
Sorry, exactly.
That's where it should be. It's fun.
It doesn't do it.
Short after the personal program.
So go ahead and take a minute to wrap up.
Yeah, energy drinks really.
Those are nice. Those are what should be.
I've never had them.
I drink two.
Never had it. Me a larger.
No, I drink two of them at once.
Oh my
Just
gosh.
did my heart is fucking so bad.
We're going like 6 or 8 rolls. Like a lot. Like more emotional. I was just like,
Oh.
So let's talk through this scenario and some of the ways that we can incorporate different styles of listening here. So the first question would be how you would use active and empathic listening. Let's hear from the partnership back here about some of the ways that you talked about this first part.
The way I kind of look view it is, I think there would be kind of an almost community use of empathic listening, because by the way comes across, it sounds more like a matter of simply a disorganization of their schedule. So then I think there's a lot of things that they could do to improve,
Sure.
to figure like a lot easier out themselves, rather than it being simply objective factors that might cause issues for them.
Sure. So if you were listening to that message, right, if this was your friend and they were talking to you about this, like what would that response look like from an active empathic perspective?
This is pretty relatable to me as well. So how I would respond is I would make a series of relatable scenarios that apply to myself as well.
Yeah.
And kind of make a verbal show of, hey, I can relate to this.
Yeah, I like that you bring that in, right? Because if you're looking at this story, you think maybe this is a friend that's disorganized, they don't have their stuff together in the way that they should, right? And maybe you think that initially when you're going in, but like you were saying, active empathic listening would leave some of that at the door, right? It's acknowledging, yeah, my friend seems a little flaky, but I have some relatable stories and challenges that I've gone through, and I can use them to connect to that person, right? To make something personally meaningful and significant. The four over here had some interesting points about critical listening. How would you all use critical listening?
So we said with critical listening that that we kind of noticed that there was a lot of things on there that he could have controlled.
Yeah,
and that we're gonna still support him, but we're definitely gonna let him know that there are things that we can fix that could change stuff. So like, his mom's coming over to visit, so you'll be really busy. I thought you don't have a job anymore, so your mom coming would be a good reset.
yeah,
So maybe it's not as bad as you think it's gonna be.
yeah. Or like, you're responsible for like getting a new alarm or getting your alarm clock to work properly. I like that you brought up that you'll have this time with the mom coming over to visit and questioning whether or not that makes you super busy, right? So like you were saying, critical listening is really about picking it apart, looking at the major claims or points that are being made here, right? The assumptions and leaps that this person is saying, because they're definitely at the end here saying, doesn't feel like I have control over my life, when there are things that that person could do to make things easier. So critical listening might not be the most appropriate, but if you were somebody like a supervisor, right, who heard this story compared to a friend, you might be understanding, but maybe a more critical listener given the role that you have, right? So the role we occupy matters in impacting the way that we choose to listen. And I'd like to hear maybe from the group that was on Zoom, whether they considered this message here to be a listenable message. What came up for you all?
We considered this message to not necessarily be super listenable just because there's several different topics brought up, just like that didn't necessarily go together, I guess. Like him being busy, but his mom's coming over and such. And then like the alarm clock being a big reason for why he was fired, but it seems like a manageable fix. So as a critical listener, you would kind of just consider some of the things that were said and the credibility of it and such.
Yeah. So when it comes to a listenable message, I like some of the points you brought up earlier about how a listenable message, right, stays on focus and it presents things clearly, right? There's a lot of points here where it's pretty tangential, it's going off topic, it's saying things like, I don't have control over my life, and jumping around a lot, right? So to be a good speaker, maybe if there's something important we want to say, that we keep it focused, right? But we also know when we listen casually that we do go on tangents naturally in conversation. The way that we form sentences when we're talking face to face is really different than what we do when it's written, right? So the flow of the major points being made here is definitely a big part of whether this is a listenable message, right? Also, there is a lot of like I and me language being used here. So they are describing the story and using some details here. There's definitely, especially when it comes to organization, a lot of parts that are jumbled, unclear, and don't make a whole lot of sense. So I wanted to use this exercise as a way to get us to think about the different ways that we listen and the different conclusions that we come through our listening, right? That we come to through listening. So for instance, again, active empathic, we wouldn't be judging the person, right, on whether or not they have their alarm set or the things that they could do, but we're trying to create relatable experiences, we're trying to understand, and we might have friends like that, where we know if we tell them, oh, hey, you're being so flaky, you're not doing a good job, that would hurt them, right, or not be a good approach for that situation. It might not be the advice that they're looking for, right, so we have to withhold that. The critical listening, again, picks apart the major ideas and logical jumps that they're trying to make here to say, oh, I don't have control over my life, I'm super busy. And then listenability, again, is about how much that message is presented in a way that other people can understand and follow along. Some of the gaps here, like your mom coming to visit, meaning that you're super busy, might not be very listenable because we don't understand why that would make that person as busy as they would be, right? So continue to think about these different types of listening and distinguishing these when you think about the situation that you find yourself in and that you have to listen to it. So to wrap up for today, we, in addition to active listening, brought in some of the ideas about critical and active empathic listening. Again, these are good things to know and continue to think about when you're building good listening skills. Also, right, a listenable environment has good listening skills in the group as a whole. We talked about listenable messages and presenting those well too. If you are in the Zoom group, please email me your work on this, and you can include all the group members in that email. So for next class, again, we don't meet on Monday, enjoy your long weekend with MLK Day. And next Wednesday, we'll be talking about how media facilitates different types of listening. So please email or pass forward your comments for your group. I only need one per group. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.